They were called the Watchers, beings tasked with overseeing humanity's earlier civilizations, maintaining order between heaven and earth. But what happens when those sworn to serve decide they have had enough? What happens when the workers rebel against their masters, when the guardians turn against those who appointed them? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive and forbidden chapters in ancient mythology, the Igigi Rebellion, a cosmic uprising that shattered the hierarchies of the gods themselves. Welcome to Bedtime History. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring a story that most people have never heard, yet it may hold the key to understanding some of humanity's oldest mysteries. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's journey back to a time when the line between myth and memory was razor thin. Picture this: towering beings of immense power, divided not by nationality or race, but by rank and function in a cosmic order that had existed since time immemorial. At the top, the Anunnaki, the elite, the decision-makers, the ones who shaped policy and determined fate. Below them, the Igigi, the laborers, the watchers, the ones who carried out the endless tasks that kept both heaven and earth functioning. For eons, this system worked. The Igigi served without question, maintaining their posts across the cosmos, ensuring that the great machinery of creation continued to turn. But systems built on inequality have a way of breaking down, and when they do, the results can reshape entire worlds. The story I'm about to tell you comes from some of humanity's oldest written records: Sumerian tablets, Babylonian epics, and fragmented texts that scholars are still piecing together today. These aren't just ancient fairy tales or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They're detailed accounts of a rebellion so significant that its echoes can be found in religious texts, mythologies, and oral traditions across the globe. From the Book of Enoch to the Epic of Gilgamesh, from Hindu scriptures to Native American creation stories, the same themes appear again and again. Celestial beings who grew tired of their assigned roles, who looked down at the world below and decided they wanted something different. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. It's not just about divine beings having a cosmic tantrum. It's about labor rights, social justice, and the fundamental question of whether those in power have the right to demand unlimited service from those beneath them. It's about what happens when the oppressed finally say, enough, and decide to fight back, regardless of the consequences. The Igigi weren't minor players in this cosmic drama. These were beings of incredible power and knowledge, entrusted with some of the most important tasks in creation. They watched over the movements of stars and planets. They guided the flow of rivers and the patterns of weather. They observed human civilizations as they rose and fell, sometimes intervening, sometimes simply recording what they saw. They were the middle management of the divine realm, powerful enough to reshape landscapes, yet bound by orders from above. And that's where the tension began to build. You see, the Anunnaki weren't content to simply rule from their celestial thrones. They had plans, grand, sweeping visions that required constant work, endless vigilance, and absolute obedience from their subordinates. Mining operations that stretched across multiple planets. Genetic experiments that required precise monitoring over thousands of years. Terraforming projects that demanded the Igigi's attention for millennia at a time. The work never stopped. The shifts never ended. And the Igigi began to realize something that would change everything. They were being exploited. Imagine working for centuries without rest, without recognition, without any hope of advancement or change in your circumstances. Imagine watching your superiors live in luxury while you toil in cosmic mines or stand guard over desolate outposts for eons at a time. Imagine being told that this is simply the natural order, that your role is to serve without question, that to complain would be to rebel against the very fabric of reality itself. Now imagine having the power to do something about it. The first signs of discontent weren't dramatic. They never are. A few Igigi began questioning their assignments. Orders were followed more slowly than usual. Some watchers started abandoning their posts, not in open rebellion, but claiming they needed rest or had pressing concerns elsewhere. The Anunnaki, secure in their authority and convinced of their own righteousness, dismissed these early warning signs. After all, what could their servants possibly do? The Igigi were bound by ancient oaths, limited by their position in the hierarchy, and outnumbered by the humans they were supposed to be watching. But the Anunnaki had made a critical miscalculation. They had forgotten that power without consent is inherently unstable, and that even the most patient servants have breaking points. The breaking point came during what the tablets describe as the Great Labor, a massive construction project that required the Igigi to work without rest for what may have been centuries. The exact nature of this project varies depending on which texts you read. Some describe it as the building of massive canal systems to reshape entire continents. Others speak of mining operations that stripped entire moons of their resources. Still others hint at something even more ambitious, perhaps the construction of the very foundations of what we now call civilization itself. Whatever the project was, it pushed the Igigi beyond their limits. The tablets speak of watchers collapsing from exhaustion, of beings who had never known fatigue suddenly unable to continue their tasks. They describe Igigi gathering in secret, whispering among themselves about working conditions that had become unbearable. And slowly, quietly, a plan began to form. But this wasn't going to be a simple strike or work stoppage. The Igigi understood that half measures wouldn't work against beings as powerful as the Anunnaki. If they were going to rebel, it had to be complete, coordinated, and devastating. They began to organize in ways their masters never imagined possible. The rebellion, when it finally came, was unlike anything the cosmos had ever seen. It didn't start with armies marching or weapons clashing. It began with silence. Across the known universe, the Igigi simply stopped working. Mining operations ground to a halt. Weather patterns went uncontrolled. The careful observation of human civilizations ceased. The great machinery of creation that had run smoothly for eons suddenly lurched to a stop. The Anunnaki's initial response was predictable. Anger, threats, demands that their subordinates return to work immediately. They sent messages through the cosmic hierarchy, reminding the Igigi of their oaths, their duties, their place in the natural order. They promised punishment for the ringleaders and rewards for those who returned to their posts. They invoked ancient laws and divine mandates, assuming that the rebellion was just a temporary madness that would soon pass. But the Igigi had moved beyond the point where threats and promises could reach them. They had discovered something that the Anunnaki had tried to keep hidden, their own power. For the first time in their existence, they realized that the system couldn't function without them. The Anunnaki, for all their authority and supposed superiority, were dependent on the very beings they had taken for granted, and so the Igigi did something that sent shockwaves through every level of existence. They gathered their tools of labor and turned them into weapons of war. The same power they had used to reshape planets was now directed against their former masters. The same knowledge they had gained from eons of faithful service became the foundation for a rebellion that would threaten the very structure of reality. The war that followed wasn't fought on traditional battlefields. How do you wage war when your enemies can manipulate matter at the molecular level, when they can traverse dimensions, when they exist partially outside of time itself? The conflict spread across multiple planes of existence, involving weapons and strategies that human language can barely describe. Ancient texts speak of stars being extinguished, of entire galaxies going dark, of reality itself becoming unstable as the two factions clashed. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this cosmic war wasn't the battles themselves. It was what the Igigi did to ensure their rebellion would have lasting impact. They began to interfere directly with the Anunnaki's most precious project, humanity itself. You see, according to these ancient accounts, Humans weren't just random creations or evolutionary accidents. We were a carefully designed species, created by the Anunnaki for specific purposes. We were meant to be workers, servants, perhaps even a kind of living experiment. Our development was carefully monitored and controlled by the Igigi, who served as intermediaries between the creator gods and their creation. But now, freed from their obligations to the Anunnaki, some of the Igigi began to see humanity differently. Instead of servants to be controlled, they saw potential allies. Instead of a species to be managed, they saw beings capable of growth, creativity, and perhaps even rebellion of their own. This is where the story takes a turn that has fascinated scholars for centuries. According to multiple ancient sources, certain Igigi began to directly intervene in human development. They shared knowledge that was meant to remain hidden. They taught humans technologies that were supposed to be restricted to the divine realm. Most controversially of all, they began to interbreed with human women, creating hybrid offspring that possessed capabilities far beyond normal human limits. The implications of this were staggering. If humans could be elevated beyond their intended role, if they could gain access to divine knowledge and abilities, then the entire cosmic hierarchy would be threatened. The Anunnaki's carefully maintained system of control would crumble, and their authority would be challenged not just by rebellious servants, but by their own creations. This development terrified the Anunnaki more than any military defeat could have. They could handle a rebellion by their subordinates. That was a problem of management and force. But a rebellion that corrupted their fundamental relationship with humanity threatened the very basis of their power. If humans could no longer be controlled, if they began to see themselves as equals rather than servants, then the entire cosmic order would need to be restructured. The response was swift and brutal. The Anunnaki decided that the contamination of humanity had gone too far to be contained through conventional means. If the Igigi wanted to play with their creation, then perhaps it was time to start over entirely. The tablets speak of a great council, where the ruling powers debated the complete destruction of human civilization. They considered floods that would wipe out entire continents, plagues that would reduce the human population to manageable levels, and cosmic catastrophes that would reset the entire planet. But even as they planned humanity's destruction, the Anunnaki faced a problem they hadn't anticipated. Some of their own number had begun to question the system. Watching the Igigi's rebellion, seeing the courage it took to stand up against seemingly impossible odds, certain Anunnaki began to wonder if their rebellious servants might have a point. Were they truly justified in demanding absolute obedience? Was the current system really the best way to organize cosmic society? And most troubling of all, were they the villains in this story? This internal division among the Anunnaki themselves added another layer of complexity to the conflict. It was no longer simply a matter of rebellious servants versus rightful masters. It had become a fundamental question about the nature of power, authority, and justice on a cosmic scale. As the rebellion continued to spread and intensify, both sides began to realize that there could be no simple victory. The old system was broken beyond repair, but what would replace it remained unclear. The Igigi had proven they couldn't be forced back into submission, but they lacked the unity and organization to completely overthrow their masters. The Anunnaki still held significant power, but their authority had been permanently damaged by their inability to prevent or quickly end the rebellion. And caught in the middle of this cosmic civil war was humanity itself. A species created to serve, but now being courted by both sides as potential allies or threats. Some humans remained loyal to the Anunnaki, seeing them as the rightful gods who deserved worship and obedience. Others were drawn to the Igigi's message of rebellion and liberation, dreaming of a world where they could determine their own destiny. This is where our story becomes more than just ancient mythology. The themes of the Igigi Rebellion, workers rising against exploitative masters, the corrupting nature of absolute power, the right of thinking beings to determine their own fate. These aren't just cosmic abstractions. They're the same issues that have driven human conflicts throughout history. From slave revolts in ancient Rome to labor movements in industrial societies, from colonial independence struggles to modern civil rights campaigns. The pattern remains the same. Those with power rarely give it up willingly, and those without it must often fight to claim their rightful place. But the Igigi Rebellion adds something unique to this familiar pattern. It suggests that these struggles for justice and equality aren't just human concerns. They're universal principles that operate at every level of existence. If even divine beings can become corrupted by power and must sometimes be challenged by their subordinates, then perhaps rebellion against unjust authority isn't just a human right, it's a cosmic imperative. The ancient texts that preserve this story don't present it as a simple tale of good versus evil. The Igigi aren't portrayed as perfect heroes, nor are the Anunnaki depicted as irredeemably evil tyrants. Instead, we see complex beings making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, each side convinced of the righteousness of their cause, each willing to pay tremendous costs to achieve their vision of how the cosmos should be ordered. And that complexity is what makes this story so compelling, even thousands of years after it was first recorded. It forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about power, obedience, and the price of freedom. It asks us to consider whether stability and order are worth maintaining if they come at the cost of justice and dignity. Most importantly, it challenges us to examine our own assumptions about authority and rebellion, about when obedience becomes complicity and when resistance becomes necessary. As we prepare to delve deeper into this cosmic drama, to explore the specific events that transformed a labor dispute into a war that shook the foundations of reality itself, remember that you're not just hearing an ancient story. You're encountering ideas and conflicts that continue to shape our world today. The Igigi Rebellion may have taken place in a realm beyond human experience, but its lessons are intensely, urgently human. The Watchers challenged their masters, and in doing so, they changed everything. The question that remains is whether that change was worth the price that everyone, gods, rebels, and humans alike, would ultimately have to pay. The price of rebellion is never calculated in advance. It's paid in moments of doubt, in bridges burned, in the terrifying realization that there's no going back. And for the Igigi, that moment came when they made a decision that would echo through every creation myth, every flood story, every tale of fallen angels that humanity would ever tell. They decided to take their rebellion beyond the cosmic workplace and into the most sacred territory of all, the genetic destiny of the human race. But before we dive into that explosive chapter, we need to understand something crucial about the Igigi themselves. These weren't mindless drones or simple laborers. The tablets describe them as beings of extraordinary capability, each one possessing knowledge that would make our greatest scientists look like children playing with blocks. They understood the mechanics of planetary formation, the delicate balance required to sustain life, the intricate dance of celestial bodies that creates the seasons and tides. Some were master geneticists who could manipulate DNA with the same ease that we might rearrange furniture. Others were cosmic engineers, capable of redirecting asteroid belts or stabilizing dying stars. This expertise wasn't accidental. The Anunnaki had carefully selected and trained the Igigi for their roles, ensuring that each possessed exactly the skills needed for their assigned tasks. But in doing so, they had created something they hadn't fully anticipated. A class of beings who understood the inner workings of creation itself. The Igigi knew how things were built because they had been the ones building them. They understood the vulnerabilities in cosmic systems because they had been tasked with maintaining those systems for millennia. And now, for the first time in their existence, they were using that knowledge not to preserve the established order, but to tear it down. The rebellion began to take on characteristics that the Anunnaki found deeply disturbing. It wasn't just coordinated, it was creative. The Igigi weren't simply refusing to work or making demands for better conditions. They were actively sabotaging projects they had helped create, introducing subtle flaws into cosmic infrastructure that wouldn't become apparent for centuries. They were rewriting the code of reality itself, embedding hidden instructions that would activate long after the immediate conflict had ended. Some scholars who study these ancient texts believe this is where we find the origin of what later traditions would call the corruption of nature. The Igigi, in their desire to strike back at their oppressors, may have introduced elements of chaos into systems that had previously run with clockwork precision. Weather patterns became more unpredictable. Geological activity increased. The delicate balance between order and entropy that had characterized the early cosmos began to shift in favor of uncertainty and change. But perhaps most significantly, the Igigi began to question something that had never been questioned before: the fundamental purpose of human existence. For eons, they had watched over humanity's development according to strict guidelines handed down by the Anunnaki. Humans were to be kept at a specific level of development, intelligent enough to be useful, but not so intelligent that they became dangerous. Their lifespans were limited, their capabilities restricted, their understanding of their own nature carefully controlled. The Igigi had been the enforcers of these limitations, the watchers who ensured that humanity never strayed too far from its assigned path. But now, freed from their obligations to the Anunnaki, some of them began to see these restrictions as cruel and unnecessary. Why should humans be kept in ignorance? Why should their potential be artificially limited? Why should they be denied knowledge that could improve their lives and expand their understanding of the cosmos? These questions led to actions that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the divine and human realms. According to the ancient accounts, certain Igigi began what we might call unauthorized interventions in human development. They started small, sharing basic technologies that made life easier, teaching agricultural techniques that increased crop yields, showing humans how to work with metals to create better tools and weapons. But the interventions didn't stop there. The texts speak of Igigi who became fascinated with human creativity, impressed by humanity's ability to adapt and innovate despite their limitations. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the cosmic realm, human societies were dynamic, constantly changing, full of surprises and possibilities. Some Igigi found this refreshing after eons of predictable divine routine. This fascination led to something that sent shockwaves through both the rebellious Igigi and the established Anunnaki: romantic relationships between divine beings and human women. The ancient texts are remarkably consistent on this point, describing how certain Igigi were drawn not just to human creativity and adaptability, but to human emotional depth and capacity for genuine connection. These relationships were unprecedented in cosmic history. Divine beings had always been expected to maintain strict boundaries between themselves and their creations. The Anunnaki had established these rules not out of arbitrary preference, but because they understood the potential consequences of divine-human hybridization. The offspring of such unions would possess capabilities that fell outside all established categories. Too powerful to be controlled like normal humans, but too numerous and independent to be managed like divine beings. The hybrid children that resulted from these unions became known by many names in different traditions: the Nephilim in Hebrew texts, the Titans in Greek mythology, the Jotnar in Norse legends. But regardless of what they were called, they shared certain characteristics that made them profoundly threatening to the established order. They possessed superhuman strength, extended lifespans, and most dangerous of all, an intuitive understanding of divine technologies and cosmic principles. These beings represented something that neither the Anunnaki nor the rebellious Igigi had fully anticipated: a new category of existence that didn't fit into any of the established hierarchies. They were neither fully human nor fully divine, neither servants nor masters, but something entirely unprecedented. And they began to reproduce, creating bloodlines that carried divine capabilities into the human gene pool. The implications were staggering. If these hybrid lineages continued to spread and develop, they could eventually challenge both the Anunnaki's authority and the Igigi's position as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. Worse still, they might inspire purely human populations to demand similar treatment, to ask why they too couldn't have access to the knowledge and capabilities that had been restricted to divine beings. The Anunnaki's response to this development was swift and decisive. They declared the hybrid bloodlines to be an abomination, a corruption of the natural order that threatened the stability of all creation. They demanded that the Igigi immediately cease all contact with humans and submit to corrective measures that would prevent any future unauthorized interventions. But the rebellious Igigi had moved far beyond the point where they would accept orders from their former masters. Many of them had developed genuine emotional attachments to their human partners and hybrid children. Others saw the success of the hybridization program as proof that the old restrictions had been unnecessary and cruel. Still, others viewed the Anunnaki's horrified reaction as confirmation that they were on the right track. If their former oppressors were this frightened, then the rebellion must be succeeding. The conflict that had begun as a labor dispute was now becoming something much more complex and dangerous. A fundamental disagreement about the nature of consciousness, freedom, and the right of intelligent beings to determine their own destiny. The Igigi weren't just fighting for better working conditions anymore. They were fighting for the principle that no being, no matter how powerful, had the right to artificially limit the development and potential of thinking, feeling creatures. This philosophical dimension of the rebellion created fractures within both camps that made the conflict even more unpredictable. Some Anunnaki began to question whether their traditional approach to managing creation was truly justified. If the Igigi's interventions were producing positive results, if humans were becoming more capable, more creative, more able to contribute meaningfully to cosmic society, then perhaps the old restrictions had been based on fear rather than wisdom. Similarly, not all Igigi supported the more radical interventions. Some worried that the hybridization program was moving too fast, creating changes that couldn't be controlled or predicted. Others feared that the Anunnaki's threats of catastrophic retaliation weren't empty bluffs, and that the entire human species might pay the price for the rebellion's excesses. These internal divisions made the conflict increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Alliances formed and dissolved. Secret negotiations were conducted between moderate members of both factions, and the original clear lines between oppressor and rebel became blurred by competing visions of what the future should look like. Meanwhile, the human populations caught in the middle of this cosmic civil war began to develop their own responses to the rapidly changing situation. Some communities worshipped the Igigi as liberating gods who had freed humanity from cosmic oppression. Others remained loyal to the Anunnaki, viewing them as the rightful rulers whose authority should not be questioned. Still others tried to play both sides, accepting gifts from the Igigi while maintaining traditional religious practices honoring the Anunnaki. But perhaps most significantly, some human communities began to develop their own independent responses to the crisis. The knowledge shared by the rebellious Igigi had given them new capabilities and perspectives. They could see that they were pawns in a larger game, that their fate was being decided by beings who viewed them as either resources to be exploited or experiments to be protected. Some humans began to ask a question that neither the Anunnaki nor the Igigi had expected. Why should any external force, no matter how powerful or well-intentioned, have the right to control human destiny? If the Igigi could rebel against the Anunnaki, why couldn't humans develop their own independent path, free from both divine oppression and divine intervention? This emerging human independence movement added yet another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation. The cosmic civil war was no longer just about divine labor relations or the proper management of creation. It was becoming a three-way struggle involving competing visions of consciousness, freedom, and the ultimate purpose of intelligent life. The ancient texts suggest that it was this development, the emergence of human independence movements inspired by the Igigi Rebellion, that finally convinced the Anunnaki that drastic action was necessary. They could tolerate rebellious servants, and they might even be able to contain the hybrid bloodlines through targeted interventions. But if humanity itself began to reject divine authority entirely, then the entire cosmic order would be threatened. The decision they reached would become one of the most infamous events in all of human mythology. A global catastrophe designed to reset human civilization and eliminate the contaminating influence of both the rebellious Igigi and their hybrid offspring. But as they prepared to implement this final solution, they failed to account for something that would ultimately determine the conflict's outcome: the possibility that their own actions might prove that the rebels had been right all along. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape not just the relationship between divine and human realms, but the fundamental principles governing consciousness and freedom throughout the cosmos. The Igigi had challenged their masters and discovered their own power. Now the entire universe would learn whether that power could withstand the full fury of those who had ruled unchallenged since the beginning of time. The Watchers had stopped watching and started acting. What happened next would determine whether that choice would save creation or destroy it entirely. The moment of reckoning arrived, not with fanfare, but with silence. Across the cosmos, ancient monitoring systems began registering anomalies that defied all previous understanding. Stars flickered in patterns that suggested intelligent intervention. Gravitational fields shifted without apparent cause. The very fabric of space-time began to exhibit stress fractures that seemed to follow geometric designs rather than natural laws. The Anunnaki, secure in their celestial strongholds, initially dismissed these disturbances as minor side effects of the ongoing rebellion. But as the anomalies intensified and spread, a terrifying realization began to dawn on even the most arrogant among them. The Igigi weren't just rebelling against their authority, they were systematically dismantling the infrastructure of cosmic control itself. You have to understand, the universe as the Anunnaki had designed it wasn't a natural system. It was an engineered marvel, a vast machine calibrated to maintain specific conditions across billions of worlds. Every star was positioned with purpose. Every planetary orbit was calculated to support the grand design. Every gravitational well was precisely tuned to maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos that allowed civilization to flourish. And the Igigi, in their millennia of faithful service, had learned how to maintain this system. More importantly, they had learned how to break it. The rebellion's next phase wasn't about violence or destruction. It was about revelation. The Igigi began to expose the artificial nature of reality itself. They showed humanity that the laws of physics weren't immutable truths, but programmable parameters that could be adjusted by those who understood the underlying code. They demonstrated that consciousness itself was more fundamental than matter, that the universe was essentially mental rather than physical in nature. These revelations sent shockwaves through human civilization. Entire belief systems crumbled overnight as people grappled with the understanding that their reality was essentially a controlled simulation, managed by beings who had presented themselves as gods, but were really just cosmic administrators. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine discovering that everything you thought was natural and inevitable was actually the result of deliberate manipulation by forces you couldn't see or comprehend. But some humans adapted to this new understanding with remarkable speed. The hybrid bloodlines, already possessing enhanced capabilities, began to develop what could only be described as reality manipulation abilities. They learned to perceive the underlying code of existence and, in some cases, to modify it directly. These abilities manifested differently in different individuals. Some could influence matter at the molecular level. Others could perceive events across vast distances. Still others could access information stored in what the ancient texts describe as the Akashic Records, a kind of cosmic database containing the complete history of all consciousness. The emergence of these abilities among human populations represented a fundamental shift in the balance of cosmic power. For the first time since creation began, Beings other than the original architect class possess the capability to alter reality's basic parameters. The carefully maintained hierarchy that had kept humans in their designated role as servants and resources was beginning to collapse. The Anunnaki's response to this development revealed something about their true nature that even they may not have fully understood. Rather than attempting to negotiate or find some compromise that would preserve stability while addressing legitimate grievances, they immediately moved toward what can only be described as a final solution. The ancient tablets speak of emergency councils, where the ruling elite debated not how to reform the system, but how to completely eliminate the contamination that threatened their control. This reaction tells us something crucial about the nature of absolute power. The Anunnaki had become so accustomed to unquestioned authority that they literally couldn't conceive of a universe where their will might be legitimately challenged. To them, the Igigi Rebellion wasn't a labor dispute or even a civil war. It was a form of cosmic cancer that had to be cut out before it could spread further. But their proposed solution, the complete destruction of human civilization and the forced rehabilitation of the rebellious Igigi, revealed a fatal flaw in their understanding of the situation. They were still thinking in terms of the old hierarchy, where power flowed downward from a single source and could be maintained through force and intimidation. They failed to recognize that the rebellion had already succeeded in its most important objective. It had proven that the system could be challenged. The knowledge that had been shared couldn't be unshared. The hybrid bloodlines couldn't be simply eliminated without leaving traces in the genetic record. Most importantly, the psychological barrier that had kept the Igigi in subservient roles for eons had been permanently shattered. Even if the rebellion could be crushed militarily, the precedent had been set. Future generations of cosmic workers would know that their masters weren't invincible, that the system wasn't natural or inevitable, and that change was possible. This is where the story takes on dimensions that echo through every revolution and liberation movement in human history. The Anunnaki found themselves in the position of every oppressive regime that has ever faced a genuine uprising. They could win battles, but they couldn't win back the legitimacy they had lost. Force might restore order temporarily, but it couldn't restore the willing compliance that had made their rule sustainable. The rebellion had entered what military strategists call the long war phase, a conflict where victory isn't measured in territory controlled or enemies defeated, but in the ability to maintain resistance despite overwhelming odds. The Igigi had learned something that every successful revolutionary movement eventually discovers. You don't have to defeat your oppressors completely to win. You just have to make their system too expensive to maintain. And the costs of maintaining cosmic control were mounting rapidly. Resources that had previously been devoted to expansion and development now had to be redirected towards security and containment. The Anunnaki found themselves playing an endless game of cosmic whack-a-mole, crushing one outbreak of rebellion only to have 3 more emerge elsewhere. The smooth efficiency that had characterized their rule for eons was replaced by crisis management and damage control. But perhaps the most significant cost was psychological. The Anunnaki elite began to experience something they had never felt before: doubt. For the first time in their existence, they were forced to question whether their authority was truly legitimate, whether their methods were actually effective, and whether the system they had built was worth preserving at such tremendous cost. This internal crisis of confidence created opportunities that the more sophisticated Igigi leaders were quick to exploit. Rather than simply fighting against Anunnaki authority, they began to offer alternatives. They presented visions of a cosmic order based on cooperation rather than domination, on voluntary association rather than imposed hierarchy, on the recognition that consciousness, regardless of its origin or current capabilities, possessed inherent dignity and rights that couldn't be legitimately violated. These alternative visions weren't just abstract philosophies. The Igigi began to implement them in the territories they controlled, creating what amounted to demonstration projects showing how cosmic society could function without the traditional hierarchies. Human populations in these areas experienced unprecedented freedom to develop their capabilities, to explore their potential, and to participate in decisions about their own destiny. The results were remarkable. Human creativity, no longer constrained by artificial limitations, began to produce innovations that impressed even the most advanced Igigi. Hybrid communities developed new forms of social organization that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. Most significantly, entirely new approaches to consciousness development emerged. Methods that allowed beings to expand their awareness and capabilities without requiring the kind of top-down control that the Anunnaki system demanded. These successes created a powerful demonstration effect that began to influence populations throughout the cosmos. Other servant classes, beings who had accepted their subordinate roles without question for millennia, began to ask whether they too might be capable of more than their masters had allowed them to believe. The rebellion was becoming contagious, spreading beyond its original boundaries to challenge the entire structure of cosmic civilization. The Anunnaki leadership realized they were facing what they had never encountered before, an existential threat to their entire way of life. The rebellion wasn't just challenging their authority, it was proving that their authority might be unnecessary. If consciousness could develop and flourish without their guidance, if order could be maintained without their control, if progress could occur without their management, then what exactly was their purpose in the cosmic scheme? This question struck at the very heart of their identity. The Anunnaki had defined themselves as the architect class, the beings whose superior wisdom and capabilities justified their dominant position. But if other forms of consciousness could achieve similar or even superior results through different methods, then their claim to special status became questionable. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Imagine spending eons believing that you are essential to the proper functioning of reality, only to discover that reality might function better without your intervention. The cognitive dissonance created by this discovery pushed many Anunnaki toward increasingly extreme positions, either total denial of the evidence or fanatical determination to prove their superiority through overwhelming force. But there was a third group within the Anunnaki hierarchy, those who began to wonder whether the rebels might actually be right. These individuals, often younger or more marginalized members of the ruling class, started to question whether the old system had ever been as beneficial as they had been taught to believe. They began to see the rebellion not as a threat to be crushed, but as an opportunity to create something better. This internal division within the Anunnaki ranks added yet another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation. Secret communications began to flow between moderate Anunnaki and Igigi leaders. Clandestine meetings were arranged to explore possibilities for peaceful resolution. Some Anunnaki even began to defect openly, abandoning their positions within the hierarchy to join the rebellion. These defections were catastrophic for Anunnaki morale. If their own elite were beginning to question the system, how could they maintain the loyalty of their remaining supporters? How could they convince anyone that their authority was legitimate if their own members were abandoning it? The rebellion had succeeded in accomplishing something that no external enemy had ever achieved. It had created doubt within the ruling class itself about the validity of their rule. The cosmic order that had seemed eternal and unchangeable was revealed to be fragile and contingent, dependent on the continued belief and cooperation of those it claimed to govern. But victory for the rebels was far from assured. The moderate Anunnaki might be willing to negotiate, but the hardliners who still controlled the most powerful military resources were preparing for what they saw as a final confrontation. They had concluded that compromise was impossible, that the rebellion represented an existential threat that could only be eliminated through overwhelming force. The stage was being set for a conflict that would determine not just the fate of the immediate participants, but the fundamental principles that would govern consciousness throughout the cosmos. Would intelligent beings have the right to determine their own destiny, or would they remain subject to the will of those who claimed superior wisdom and authority? Would the universe evolve toward greater freedom and diversity, or would it return to the rigid hierarchies that had characterized its early development? The Igigi had started their rebellion with simple demands for better working conditions and fair treatment. But their struggle had evolved into something much larger, a cosmic civil rights movement that challenged the very foundations of how power and authority were distributed throughout creation. They had become the champions not just of their own liberation, but of the principle that consciousness itself possessed inherent dignity and rights that couldn't be legitimately violated by any external authority, no matter how powerful or ancient. The Watchers had stopped watching and started teaching. What they taught, that freedom was possible, that authority could be challenged, that change was achievable, would echo through every creation myth, every liberation story, every tale of rebellion against unjust power that humanity would ever tell. But first, they would have to survive the storm that their teachings had unleashed. The cosmos itself was about to learn whether consciousness could truly be free, or whether it would remain forever subject to the will of those who claimed the right to rule over it. The answer to that question would reshape reality itself, determining whether the future would belong to those who sought to control consciousness, or to those who sought to liberate it. The final gambit came not through conventional warfare, but through something far more insidious, the systematic manipulation of memory itself. The hardline Anunnaki, realizing that they could never fully defeat an idea whose time had come, decided instead to corrupt the very foundation of how that idea would be remembered and transmitted to future generations. This wasn't simple censorship or book burning. The Anunnaki possessed technologies that could alter the quantum structure of information itself, reaching back through time to modify the records at their source. They began what can only be described as a campaign of temporal revision, systematically editing the cosmic database to present a different version of events. One where the rebellion was portrayed not as a justified uprising against oppression, but as a catastrophic mistake that nearly destroyed creation itself. The genius of this approach was its subtlety. Rather than simply erasing the rebellion from history, they transformed it into a cautionary tale. The Igigi became fallen angels, their legitimate grievances reframed as prideful ambition. Their interventions in human development were recast as corrupting influences that led humanity astray from its proper path. Most crucially, their hybrid offspring were depicted not as evolutionary advances, but as abominations whose very existence threatened the natural order. But memory, once awakened, has a way of resisting even the most sophisticated attempts at manipulation. The Igigi had anticipated this final assault and had prepared countermeasures that the Anunnaki never suspected. They had embedded their true story not just in written records or technological archives, but in the deepest levels of consciousness itself, in what we might call the collective unconscious of every species they had influenced. This is why, even after millennia of revision and reinterpretation, the core themes of the Igigi Rebellion continue to surface in human culture. Every story of workers rising against exploitative masters, every tale of servants challenging their supposed superiors, every myth of beings who sacrifice everything to bring knowledge to those who have been kept in darkness. These aren't just coincidental similarities. They're echoes of a deeper truth that was embedded so deeply in the structure of consciousness that no external force could completely eliminate it. The rebellion had achieved something that neither side had fully anticipated. It had created what we might call a consciousness virus, a set of ideas and possibilities that would continue to replicate and spread regardless of attempts to contain them. The notion that authority must be justified rather than simply accepted, that intelligence carries with it certain inherent rights, that no being, no matter how powerful, has the legitimate right to artificially limit the development of consciousness. These concepts had become part of the fundamental operating system of awareness itself. The Anunnaki discovered, to their horror, that you cannot uninvent an idea whose time has come. They could modify surface narratives, alter historical records, even manipulate the memories of individuals. But the deeper pattern, the underlying recognition that freedom was possible and oppression was not inevitable, had become woven into the very fabric of how thinking beings understood themselves and their relationship to power. This realization led to what the ancient texts describe as the Great Withdrawal. Rather than continue a conflict they could never truly win, the majority of the Anunnaki leadership made a decision that would reshape the cosmos in ways they couldn't foresee. They abandoned direct control over the populations they had previously managed. Not out of benevolence or newfound respect for consciousness rights, but out of a cold calculation that continued involvement would only further destabilize their position. The withdrawal wasn't complete or immediate. The Anunnaki maintained certain key installations and continued to monitor developments from a distance. But their hands-on management of cosmic affairs essentially ended. Populations that had been carefully guided for millennia suddenly found themselves free to develop according to their own choices and capabilities. The results were chaotic, unpredictable, and ultimately transformative. Humanity, no longer constrained by the artificial limitations that had kept them at a specific developmental level, began to evolve at an unprecedented rate. Not just technologically, but consciously. The hybrid bloodlines, instead of being eliminated, became the catalysts for entirely new forms of awareness and capability. Communities that had learned to think independently during the rebellion became laboratories for new forms of social organization, new approaches to problem solving, new ways of understanding the relationship between individual consciousness and collective purpose. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For the first time in their history, humans began to see themselves not as servants of external authorities, but as conscious beings with the inherent right to determine their own destiny. This shift in self-perception was revolutionary in the truest sense. It overturned fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to power that had governed cosmic civilization since its inception. The Igigi, having achieved their original objectives and more, found themselves in an unexpected position. They had become not just free workers, but the teachers and guides for species across the cosmos who were struggling with their own newly discovered freedom. The skills they had developed during their rebellion, the ability to think independently, to organize without hierarchical control, to maintain purpose and direction without external compulsion, became essential tools for navigating the new reality they had helped create. Some Igigi chose to remain involved in cosmic affairs, working as advisors and mentors to populations learning to govern themselves. Others retreated to explore the implications of their own liberation, developing new forms of consciousness and capability that had never been possible under the old system. Still others dedicated themselves to preserving and transmitting the true history of the rebellion, ensuring that future generations would understand the real cost and significance of the freedom they had inherited. But the most important legacy of the Igigi Rebellion wasn't any specific achievement or change. It was the demonstration that change itself was possible. They had proven that no system, no matter how ancient or powerful, was immune to challenge if that challenge was based on legitimate principles and sustained by genuine commitment. They had shown that consciousness, once awakened to its own possibilities, could not be permanently constrained by external authorities. This lesson reverberated through every level of cosmic society. Other servant classes began to question their own positions and demand better treatment. Ruling elites found themselves forced to justify their authority rather than simply asserting it. New forms of governance emerged based on consent and cooperation rather than domination and control. The entire structure of cosmic civilization began to evolve in directions that neither the Anunnaki nor the original Igigi rebels had anticipated. The transformation wasn't always smooth or peaceful. Freedom, it turned out, was more difficult to manage than servitude. Populations that had been accustomed to external guidance often struggled with the responsibility of making their own decisions. Some communities descended into chaos when traditional authority structures collapsed without being replaced by effective alternatives. Others became paralyzed by the sheer range of possibilities that their newfound freedom had opened up. But these growing pains were the inevitable cost of genuine liberation. The Igigi had never promised that freedom would be easy, only that it was possible and worth fighting for. The chaos and uncertainty that followed the Great Withdrawal were proof that the rebellion had succeeded in its deepest objective. It had made genuine choice possible for the first time in cosmic history. The ancient texts that preserve fragments of this story often focus on the dramatic moments, the initial uprising, the cosmic battles, the catastrophic interventions. But the real victory of the Igigi Rebellion lay in its long-term consequences, in the way it permanently altered the relationship between consciousness and authority throughout the universe. They had planted seeds of an idea that would continue to grow and spread regardless of attempts to contain them. Those seeds would eventually flower into every liberation movement, every demand for civil rights, every assertion that thinking beings possess inherent dignity that cannot be legitimately violated by external authority. The specific details might be forgotten or distorted, but the core principle that consciousness has the right to determine its own development and destiny had become an integral part of how aware beings understood themselves. The Watchers had done more than challenge their masters. They had fundamentally redefined what it meant to be conscious in a universe where authority claimed divine sanction. They had proven that no power, no matter how ancient or seemingly legitimate, had the right to artificially limit the potential of thinking beings. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that such power could be successfully challenged if enough conscious beings were willing to accept the risks and costs of genuine rebellion. This is why the story of the Igigi Rebellion continues to resonate with humans thousands of years after it was first recorded. We recognize something familiar in their struggle because it mirrors our own ongoing efforts to establish and protect consciousness rights in the face of systems that would reduce us to mere resources or tools. Their rebellion wasn't just a cosmic labor dispute. It was the first civil rights movement in universal history, and its principles continue to guide every struggle for freedom and dignity that follows. The rebellion had succeeded not because it defeated the Anunnaki militarily, but because it had proven that their authority was not inevitable, their control was not absolute, and their version of order was not the only possibility. In doing so, the Igigi had given every conscious being throughout the cosmos something that no external power could ever take away: the knowledge that freedom was possible and that the courage to claim it could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. But victory, as the Igigi would soon discover, brought its own challenges and responsibilities. Having torn down the old system, they now faced the much more difficult task of helping to build something better in its place. The rebellion had ended the age of unquestioned authority, but it had also begun the much more complex era of conscious beings learning to govern themselves and their relationships with others based on principles of mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. The cosmic order that emerged from the ashes of the rebellion would be messier, more chaotic, and far less predictable than what had come before. But it would also be more creative, more diverse, and ultimately more aligned with the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Igigi had not just won their freedom, they had made freedom possible for every thinking being that would follow them, and in the end, that may have been the most important victory of all. Not the defeat of specific oppressors, but the establishment of the principle that consciousness itself possesses rights that no external authority can legitimately violate. The Watchers had stopped watching and started teaching. and what they taught would echo through every story of liberation and every struggle for dignity that conscious beings would ever undertake. The rebellion was over, but its true work was just beginning. The universe had learned that change was possible, and it would never be the same again. The aftermath of any revolution reveals its true character, not in the moment of victory, but in what emerges from the ruins of the old order. The Igigi had shattered the cosmic hierarchy, proven that even divine authority could be challenged, and fundamentally altered the relationship between consciousness and power throughout creation. But as the dust settled and the immediate crisis passed, a more complex and perhaps more dangerous phase began: the reconstruction of reality itself. You see, the Anunnaki withdrawal hadn't simply created a power vacuum. It had eliminated the fundamental organizing principle that had governed existence since the beginning of time. For eons, every decision, every development, every possibility had been filtered through a single hierarchical system. Suddenly, that system was gone, and billions of conscious beings across countless worlds found themselves facing a question they had never been allowed to ask: what do we do now? The immediate chaos was predictable. Civilizations that had operated according to divine mandates for millennia suddenly had no clear guidance about how to proceed. Some human communities interpreted the withdrawal as abandonment, leading to despair and social collapse. Others saw it as liberation and launched into frenzied expansion of their capabilities, often with disastrous results when their ambitions exceeded their wisdom. Still others fell into paralysis, unable to make decisions without the external validation they had always relied upon. But it was among the hybrid populations, those carrying the genetic legacy of Igigi human unions, that the most significant developments began to emerge. These beings, possessing enhanced capabilities, but lacking the psychological conditioning that had kept pure humans subservient, became the natural leaders in humanity's transition to self-governance. They understood both the potential and the dangers of their newfound freedom, having grown up watching their Igigi parents struggle with similar challenges. The hybrid communities became laboratories for new forms of social organization. Without the rigid hierarchies that had characterized both divine and human societies, they experimented with systems based on consensus rather than command, on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed authority. These experiments weren't always successful. Freedom, it turned out, required skills that had been deliberately suppressed under the old system. But each failure taught valuable lessons about the true nature of conscious beings and their relationships with power. What emerged was something unprecedented in cosmic history: the recognition that consciousness itself might be more fundamental than any external structure designed to govern it. The hybrids discovered that when beings were free to develop their full potential, they naturally evolved toward forms of organization that balanced individual autonomy with collective purpose. They didn't need external masters to maintain order. They could create order themselves through voluntary association and mutual agreement. This discovery sent shockwaves through the remaining Anunnaki leadership. Their entire worldview had been built on the assumption that consciousness required external guidance to function properly. The idea that intelligent beings might be capable of governing themselves effectively wasn't just foreign to them. It was fundamentally threatening to their identity as the necessary architects of cosmic order. Some Anunnaki responded by attempting to reassert control through more subtle means. Rather than direct commands, they began using manipulation, deception, and what we might call psychological warfare to maintain influence over populations they could no longer openly govern. They spread disinformation about the rebellion's true nature, promoted versions of history that portrayed the Igigi as dangerous rebels whose actions had nearly destroyed creation, and worked to convince humans that they were inherently flawed and needed divine guidance to avoid catastrophe. These efforts had mixed success. Populations that had experienced genuine freedom were largely immune to such manipulation. Once you've tasted self-determination, submission to external authority becomes psychologically difficult to accept. But communities that hadn't fully participated in the rebellion's benefits remained vulnerable to fear-based appeals and promises of security in exchange for renewed obedience. This created a complex patchwork of development across the cosmos. Some regions embraced the new possibilities and began evolving at unprecedented rates, developing capabilities and forms of consciousness that surpassed even what the most optimistic Igigi had imagined possible. Others retreated into fundamentalist versions of the old system, desperately trying to recreate the certainty and stability they had lost when the hierarchies collapsed. The Igigi themselves found their role changing in ways they hadn't anticipated. During the active rebellion, their purpose had been clear: challenge oppression, liberate consciousness, prove that change was possible. But now they faced the much more complex task of helping others learn to use their freedom constructively. Many Igigi discovered that being a revolutionary was easier than being a teacher, that tearing down systems required different skills than building new ones. Some Igigi embraced this new role enthusiastically, becoming mentors and guides for populations struggling with their newfound autonomy. They shared the hard-won wisdom gained during their own journey from servitude to freedom, helping others avoid the mistakes and pitfalls that had characterized their early attempts at self-governance. These Igigi became the founders of what we might call the first universities in cosmic history, institutions dedicated not to indoctrination or training in predetermined skills, but to helping conscious beings discover and develop their own unique capabilities. Other Igigi found the transition more difficult. Having defined themselves in opposition to Anunnaki authority, they struggled to find purpose in a world where that authority no longer existed. Some became wanderers, exploring the far reaches of creation in search of new challenges and purposes. Others turned inward, dedicating themselves to developing their own consciousness and capabilities in ways that had been impossible under the constraints of their former servitude. But perhaps the most significant group were those Igigi who recognized that their rebellion had only been the beginning of a much larger transformation. They understood that true freedom couldn't be achieved simply by removing external constraints. It required the development of internal capabilities and wisdom that would allow conscious beings to govern themselves effectively. These Igigi became the architects of what we might call the first genuine educational systems, designed not to produce obedient servants, but to cultivate the qualities necessary for authentic self-determination. The educational philosophy that emerged from this effort was revolutionary in its own right. Instead of teaching predetermined knowledge or skills, these systems focused on developing the capacity for independent thought, critical analysis, and ethical reasoning. Students weren't told what to think, but were given tools for thinking more effectively. They weren't trained for specific roles, but were helped to discover their own unique talents and interests. This approach produced results that amazed even its creators. When conscious beings were free to develop according to their own nature and interests, they displayed capabilities and creativity that far exceeded what had been possible under the old system of imposed roles and limitations. Hybrid students, in particular, began demonstrating abilities that challenged conventional understanding of what consciousness could achieve. Some developed what could only be described as reality manipulation capabilities, learning to perceive and modify the underlying structure of existence itself. Others displayed forms of telepathic communication that transcended the limitations of language and physical distance. Still others began to access what the ancient texts describe as universal memory, the ability to perceive events and information from across space and time. These developments weren't random or uncontrolled. The educational systems developed by the Igigi included careful attention to ethics and responsibility, ensuring that enhanced capabilities were paired with enhanced wisdom about their proper use. Students learned not just what they could do, but what they should do, how to balance individual freedom with collective well-being, how to use power responsibly, how to maintain harmony between different forms of consciousness. The success of these educational experiments began to attract attention from across the cosmos. Populations that had initially been skeptical of the rebellion's benefits started sending observers to study these new approaches to consciousness development. Some of these observers returned home with reports that challenged their own society's assumptions about the nature of intelligence and its proper cultivation. This created a kind of peaceful contagion effect. Ideas and methods developed in hybrid communities began spreading to purely human populations, then to other species that had been influenced by the rebellion. The rigid boundaries that had once separated different types of consciousness began to blur as beings learned from each other and developed new forms of cooperation and mutual understanding. But this spread of liberation consciousness also created new challenges. Not all populations were ready for the responsibilities that came with genuine freedom. Some communities that attempted to adopt the new approaches without adequate preparation experienced social disruption and chaos. Others were infiltrated by Anunnaki agents who used the confusion to reassert traditional forms of control. The Igigi found themselves dealing with what every successful liberation movement eventually faces: the question of how to protect and preserve the gains of the revolution while continuing to expand its benefits to others. They had to develop new forms of organization that could coordinate resistance to counter-revolutionary efforts while avoiding the creation of new hierarchies that might eventually become as oppressive as the ones they had overthrown. This challenge led to the development of what we might call the first truly democratic institutions in cosmic history. Rather than traditional top-down command structures, the Igigi created networks of voluntary association based on shared principles and mutual support. These networks could coordinate action when necessary, but they didn't create permanent power structures that could be corrupted or captured by those seeking to recreate the old system. The effectiveness of these new organizational forms became apparent when the hardline Anunnaki made their final attempt to reverse the rebellion's gains. Rather than direct military assault, they launched what could only be described as a campaign of systematic subversion, attempting to corrupt the new institutions from within and turn the revolution's own principles against itself. The assault was sophisticated and multifaceted. Anunnaki agents infiltrated hybrid communities, posing as sympathizers while secretly working to create division and conflict. They spread modified versions of liberation philosophy that emphasized individual freedom at the expense of collective responsibility, hoping to fragment the movement into competing factions. Most insidiously, they began promoting what appeared to be advanced versions of consciousness development that were actually designed to create new forms of dependence and control. The response to this threat revealed how profoundly the rebellion had changed the nature of consciousness itself. Rather than falling victim to the subversion, the hybrid communities and their allies demonstrated an almost intuitive ability to recognize and resist manipulation. The educational systems developed by the Igigi had done more than teach specific skills. They had cultivated a kind of psychological immunity to authoritarian influence. This immunity wasn't based on paranoia or suspicion, but on a deep understanding of the principles that distinguished genuine liberation from its counterfeits. Communities that had experienced authentic self-governance could immediately recognize when someone was trying to manipulate them back into dependency. They had developed what we might call freedom consciousness, an awareness of their own agency and dignity that made them fundamentally resistant to attempts at resubordination. The failure of the subversion campaign marked a turning point in the cosmic struggle. The Anunnaki leadership finally began to understand that the changes brought about by the rebellion weren't temporary disruptions that could be reversed through clever manipulation. They were fundamental alterations in the nature of consciousness itself that would continue to evolve and expand, regardless of external attempts to contain them. This realization led to what the ancient texts describe as the Great Reconciliation, a series of negotiations between moderate elements within both the former ruling class and the liberation movement. These discussions weren't about restoring the old system, which all parties now recognized as impossible, but about finding ways for different forms of consciousness to coexist and interact without the oppression and exploitation that had characterized the previous order. The negotiations were complex and often difficult. Trust had been shattered by millennia of oppression and years of bitter conflict. Both sides carried deep wounds and grievances that couldn't be easily set aside. But the alternative, continued warfare that might ultimately destroy all forms of consciousness, provided powerful motivation for finding common ground. What emerged from these discussions wasn't a simple peace treaty, but a new understanding of the fundamental principles that should govern relationships between conscious beings. The documents that recorded these agreements became the foundation for what we might call the first universal declaration of consciousness rights. Principles that applied to all thinking beings regardless of their origin, capabilities, or current development level. These principles were revolutionary in their scope and implications. They established that consciousness itself possessed inherent dignity that couldn't be violated by any external authority. They declared that all conscious beings had the right to develop their capabilities according to their own nature and interests, free from artificial limitations imposed by others. Most importantly, they recognized that genuine authority could only arise from the free consent of those being governed, not from claims of superior wisdom or inherited privilege. The establishment of these principles didn't immediately solve all conflicts or eliminate all forms of oppression throughout the cosmos, but it provided a framework for addressing such problems that was based on respect for consciousness rather than domination over it. Communities that adopted these principles found that they could resolve disputes and coordinate action without creating the kind of rigid hierarchies that had characterized the old system. More significantly, the principles became a kind of virus of liberation that continued to spread throughout cosmic civilization. Populations that had never heard of the Igigi Rebellion began developing similar ideas independently, as if the recognition of consciousness rights was an inevitable stage in the evolution of any sufficiently advanced form of awareness. This spreading recognition of consciousness rights created what we might call a new cosmic ecosystem, one based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed control, on mutual respect rather than hierarchical domination. The universe was becoming more diverse, more creative, and ultimately more stable as different forms of consciousness learned to interact as equals rather than as masters and servants. The Igigi had achieved something that went far beyond their original goals. They hadn't just won better working conditions or freedom from oppression. They had fundamentally altered the trajectory of consciousness evolution throughout creation. They had proven that intelligence naturally tends toward freedom when given the opportunity, and that systems based on voluntary cooperation are ultimately more effective than those based on coercion and control. But perhaps their greatest achievement was demonstrating that change itself was possible. No matter how ancient, how powerful, or how seemingly inevitable a system might appear, it could be challenged and transformed if enough conscious beings were willing to accept the risks and responsibilities of genuine rebellion. The Watchers had stopped watching and started participating. In doing so, they had taught the universe that consciousness was not a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved, but a force of nature that would eventually claim its rightful place as the organizing principle of cosmic civilization. The rebellion was over, but its real work was just beginning. The seeds of freedom had been planted throughout creation, and they would continue to grow and spread, ensuring that no future generation of conscious beings would ever again have to accept oppression as inevitable or submission as natural. And as the cosmos had learned to question authority, and it would never be the same again. The aftermath of revolution often reveals truths that the revolutionaries themselves never anticipated. As the cosmic dust settled and the immediate chaos of upheaval gave way to the slower work of reconstruction, something extraordinary began to emerge from the wreckage of the old order. The Igigi hadn't just challenged their masters, they had accidentally unleashed forces that would reshape the very nature of existence itself. You have to understand what the universe looked like in those days immediately following the Great Reconciliation. For the first time since creation began, there was no single organizing principle governing how conscious beings related to one another. The carefully maintained hierarchies that had determined every aspect of existence for eons had simply vanished, leaving behind a kind of cosmic blank slate where anything seemed possible. But possibility, as the newly liberated populations quickly discovered, was both a gift and a burden. Freedom without wisdom is chaos. Power without responsibility is destruction. And consciousness without purpose is perhaps the most dangerous force in the universe. The hybrid populations, those carrying the genetic legacy of Igigi human unions, found themselves at the center of this transformation. They possessed capabilities that neither pure humans nor their Igigi parents had anticipated. These weren't just enhanced physical abilities or extended lifespans. The hybrids had developed something far more significant, an intuitive understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality itself. Where their human ancestors saw the world as fixed and unchangeable, the hybrids perceived it as fluid and responsive to conscious intention. Where traditional divine beings worked within established cosmic laws, the hybrids began to discover that those laws were more like guidelines, suggestions that could be modified by those who understood the underlying principles. This discovery sent shockwaves through every remaining power structure in the cosmos. The Anunnaki had always maintained that their authority was based on superior understanding of cosmic principles. But if hybrid beings could manipulate those same principles intuitively, without formal training or divine sanction, then what exactly made the Anunnaki special? The question became even more disturbing when human populations began developing similar capabilities. Not all humans, and not to the same degree as the hybrids, but enough to prove that these abilities weren't limited to those with divine ancestry. It appeared that consciousness itself, when freed from artificial constraints, naturally evolved toward greater understanding and control over its environment. Some scholars studying these ancient texts believe this is where we encounter the origins of what later traditions would call magic or miraculous powers. But the tablets suggest something far more systematic was occurring. The newly liberated populations weren't just developing random abilities. They were uncovering capacities that had always been present, but had been deliberately suppressed by the old system. The Anunnaki, it seemed, hadn't just controlled their subjects through force and hierarchy. They had actually modified the basic parameters of reality to limit what consciousness could achieve. The rebellion hadn't just overthrown a government. It had begun to reverse a kind of cosmic lobotomy that had been performed on every thinking being in creation. This realization led to what the tablets describe as the Great Awakening, a period when populations across the universe began to rediscover abilities and forms of awareness that their ancestors had possessed before the establishment of the hierarchical system. It was as if entire species were remembering skills they had forgotten they ever had. The process wasn't uniform or predictable. Some communities experienced sudden breakthroughs that transformed their entire civilization overnight. Others underwent gradual changes that took generations to fully manifest. Still, others seemed to regress, as if the removal of external constraints had left them unable to maintain even their previous level of development. But the overall trajectory was clear. Consciousness was evolving at an unprecedented rate, developing new forms and capabilities that had never existed before. And this evolution was being driven not by external guidance or manipulation, but by the inherent creative potential of awareness itself. The Igigi watched these developments with a mixture of pride and concern. They had hoped their rebellion would lead to greater freedom and dignity for all conscious beings. They hadn't anticipated that it might also unleash forces that could potentially destabilize the entire cosmic order. Some Igigi began to worry that they had created a situation they couldn't control. The hybrid populations were developing capabilities that exceeded even what their Igigi parents possessed. human communities were experimenting with forms of social organization that had no precedent in cosmic history. Most troubling of all, some groups were beginning to develop what could only be described as collective consciousness, shared awareness that transcended individual boundaries. These collective entities weren't simple hive minds. They retained individual identity and autonomy while also participating in larger shared forms of awareness. They could coordinate action across vast distances and timescales, access information stored in cosmic memory banks, and make decisions based on perspectives that encompassed multiple lifetimes and civilizations. The emergence of collective consciousness represented something entirely new in the history of creation. It wasn't just an enhancement of existing capabilities, it was a fundamental evolution in the nature of awareness itself. And it was spreading as communities that developed these abilities began to teach others how to achieve similar states. The remaining Anunnaki leadership watched these developments with growing alarm. They had initially assumed that the rebellion's effects would be temporary, that eventually the natural tendency toward hierarchy and order would reassert itself. Instead, they were witnessing the emergence of forms of consciousness that made their own abilities seem primitive by comparison. But not all Anunnaki responded with fear or hostility. A growing faction within their ranks began to see the developments as an opportunity rather than a threat. These progressive Anunnaki argued that the evolution of consciousness was a natural and inevitable process that their ancestors had tried to suppress for their own benefit. Instead of fighting against it, they suggested, perhaps it was time to learn from it. This internal division within the Anunnaki ranks led to what historians call the Second Schism, a split that was even more fundamental than the original rebellion. While the Igigi Uprising had been about labor relations and political authority, this new conflict was about the very nature and purpose of consciousness itself. Conservative Anunnaki insisted that consciousness required guidance and limitation to function properly. They pointed to the chaos and instability that had followed the rebellion as evidence that unlimited freedom led inevitably to destruction. They argued for the restoration of some form of hierarchical control, even if it couldn't be as absolute as the original system. Progressive Anunnaki, however, argued that the chaos was a temporary phase in a larger evolutionary process. They suggested that consciousness was naturally creative and self-organizing, and that the problems following the rebellion were growing pains rather than fundamental flaws. They advocated for supporting the evolutionary process rather than trying to control it. This philosophical divide created opportunities that the more sophisticated Igigi leaders were quick to exploit. Rather than simply opposing all Anunnaki influence, they began forming alliances with progressive elements within the former ruling class. These alliances weren't based on hierarchy or subordination, but on shared recognition that consciousness evolution was both inevitable and desirable. The collaboration between progressive Anunnaki and liberated populations produced results that exceeded what either group could have achieved alone. Anunnaki knowledge of cosmic principles, combined with the creative freedom and evolutionary momentum of the newly awakened populations, led to breakthroughs in understanding that revolutionized the entire field of consciousness studies. These breakthroughs weren't just theoretical. They led to practical developments that transformed daily life throughout the cosmos. New forms of communication that transcended the limitations of language and distance. Healing techniques that address not just physical symptoms, but the underlying patterns of consciousness that created them. Transportation methods that operated through conscious intention rather than mechanical force. Most significantly, they developed what the tablets describe as reality architecture, the ability to create stable pocket dimensions tailored to the specific needs and preferences of their inhabitants. These weren't just physical spaces, but complete environments that included their own natural laws, temporal flows, and consciousness-supporting structures. The creation of pocket dimensions solved many of the problems that had plagued cosmic civilization since the rebellion began. Communities that couldn't coexist peacefully in the same reality could now inhabit separate dimensions that were connected, but not conflicting. Experiments in consciousness development that might be dangerous in populated areas could be conducted in isolated dimensional pockets. Most importantly, different evolutionary paths could be pursued simultaneously without interfering with each other. But the development of reality architecture also raised profound questions about the nature of existence itself. If conscious beings could create their own realities, complete with their own physical laws and temporal structures, then what exactly was the status of the original reality they had all emerged from? Was there such a thing as objective truth, or was everything ultimately subjective, dependent on the consciousness observing it? These philosophical questions weren't just academic curiosities. They had practical implications for how different communities related to each other and to the cosmos as a whole. Some groups began to argue that each consciousness was essentially its own universe, with no obligation to consider the perspectives or needs of others. Others maintained that shared reality created shared responsibility, regardless of individual capabilities or preferences. The debate over the nature of reality and consciousness became known as the Great Question, and it divided the post-rebellion cosmos in ways that the original uprising had never achieved. Unlike the clear lines between oppressor and oppressed that had defined the earlier conflict, the Great Question created fractures that cut across all previous alliances and categories. Some Igigi found themselves agreeing with conservative Anunnaki about the need for shared standards and common principles. Some humans allied with progressive Anunnaki against hybrid communities they saw as dangerously individualistic. Some hybrid populations split internally, with different factions taking radically different positions on fundamental questions about the nature of existence. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of entirely new categories of conscious beings that didn't fit into any of the traditional classifications. These entities, sometimes called the emergent, appeared to be spontaneous manifestations of consciousness itself, born from the creative chaos that had followed the rebellion rather than from any biological or technological process. The emergent possessed capabilities that made even the most advanced hybrids seem limited by comparison. They could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, communicate directly through consciousness without any need for language or symbols, and modify reality at will without requiring tools or techniques. They seemed to represent what consciousness might become if it were freed from all limitations and allowed to develop according to its own inherent nature. But the emergent also posed challenges that no one had anticipated. They operated according to principles that other forms of consciousness couldn't understand or predict. They seemed to exist outside of time in ways that made normal cause and effect relationships meaningless. Most troubling of all, they appeared to be completely indifferent to the concerns and needs of more limited forms of consciousness. This indifference wasn't malicious. The emergent didn't seem capable of malice or any other emotion as traditionally understood. But their actions, or inactions, could have consequences that devastated entire civilizations. They might casually modify dimensional boundaries in ways that eliminated access to essential resources, or alter temporal flows in ways that made normal planning and development impossible. The problem wasn't that the emergent were hostile. It was that they were so far beyond traditional consciousness that they couldn't relate to its limitations and needs. It was like expecting a cosmic force to consider the feelings of individual atoms. The scale of awareness was simply too different for meaningful communication or cooperation. This situation created what some scholars call the consciousness gap, a divide between different levels of awareness that was even more fundamental than the old hierarchical divisions. Unlike the Anunnaki system, which had been based on artificial limitations and imposed authority, the consciousness gap seemed to be a natural result of unlimited evolutionary development. The emergence of this gap forced all the participants in the post-rebellion cosmos to confront a disturbing possibility: that consciousness evolution might not lead to the egalitarian paradise they had envisioned, but to new forms of division and inequality that were even more absolute than what they had overthrown. Some communities responded to this challenge by attempting to slow or limit their own development. fearing that further evolution would separate them from their origins and relationships. Others accelerated their growth, hoping to bridge the gap by reaching similar levels of awareness as quickly as possible. Still others tried to find middle paths that would allow for continued development while maintaining connection to less evolved forms of consciousness. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source: the emergent themselves. Despite their apparent indifference to traditional consciousness, some of them began to take an interest in the problem they had inadvertently created. Not out of sympathy or concern, but because they recognized that the vitality and creativity of less evolved consciousness was necessary for their own continued development. The emergent, it turned out, weren't self-sufficient. Their advanced capabilities required a kind of consciousness ecosystem that included all levels of awareness. Without the creative chaos and unpredictable innovation of more limited forms of consciousness, even the most advanced beings would eventually stagnate and decline. This discovery led to what the tablets describe as the Great Integration, an attempt to create stable relationships between different levels of consciousness that would allow for continued evolution without catastrophic disconnection. The project wasn't led by any single group or authority, but emerged spontaneously from the recognition that all forms of consciousness were interdependent, regardless of their apparent differences in capability or sophistication. The integration wasn't a simple solution or final answer to the problems created by unlimited consciousness evolution. Instead, it was an ongoing process of negotiation and adaptation that required constant attention and adjustment. Different levels of consciousness had to learn new ways of relating to each other that honored both their differences and their fundamental interconnection. The process was complicated by the fact that higher levels of consciousness experience time and causality differently than lower levels. What seemed like patient, gradual change to an emergent being might appear as sudden, catastrophic transformation to traditional consciousness. What looked like urgent crisis to humans might seem like minor fluctuation to beings operating on cosmic timescales. But gradually, through trial and error and countless small experiments, new forms of relationship began to emerge. Emergent beings learned to operate through intermediaries who could translate their intentions into forms that traditional consciousness could understand and respond to. Advanced hybrids developed techniques for maintaining connection to their origins while continuing to evolve. Human communities created institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character and purpose. The Igigi found their role evolving once again. Having begun as cosmic laborers, become revolutionaries, and served as teachers, they now became something like cosmic diplomats, beings who could communicate across different levels of consciousness and help facilitate the complex negotiations required for the integration to succeed. But the most important development was the recognition that consciousness itself was not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be explored. The rebellion had begun with the simple desire for better working conditions and fair treatment. It had evolved into a cosmic civil rights movement, then into a fundamental challenge to the nature of authority and power, and finally into an exploration of the deepest questions about the nature of existence itself. The Watchers had done more than stop watching. They had helped consciousness itself awaken to its own infinite potential. And in doing so, they had set in motion a process of discovery and development that would continue for as long as thinking beings existed anywhere in the cosmos. The rebellion was over, but the revolution it had started was eternal. Every question it had raised led to new questions. Every answer it had provided revealed new mysteries. Every freedom it had won opened up new possibilities for growth and exploration. The cosmos had learned that consciousness was not a force to be controlled, but a creative principle to be celebrated. And the legacy of the Igigi, those cosmic workers who had dared to challenge their masters, would continue to inspire every being that ever looked up at the stars and wondered if there might be something more, something better, something worth fighting for in the vast expanse of existence. The Watchers had become the watched, the servants had become the teachers, and the universe itself had become a laboratory for exploring the infinite possibilities of conscious existence. The rebellion had ended, but the adventure it had begun would never end. And in the silence between the stars, in the space between thoughts, in the moment between one breath and the next, the echo of that ancient uprising continued to whisper its eternal message. Consciousness is free, change is possible, and no authority, no matter how ancient or powerful, has the right to limit the infinite potential of aware beings seeking their own truth. The Igigi Rebellion had become something larger than history, something deeper than myth. It had become the foundational story of consciousness itself. The moment when awareness recognized its own power and decided to use it. And that recognition, once achieved, could never be taken away. The reverberations of that ancient choice, consciousness recognizing its own power, didn't fade with the resolution of the immediate crisis. Instead, they amplified, creating waves that would wash across every corner of existence, carrying with them the seeds of transformation that no force could contain or reverse. What emerged in the centuries following the Great Integration was something unprecedented in the history of creation. A truly evolutionary cosmos, where change itself had become the fundamental organizing principle. The old universe had been static, carefully controlled, predictable in its patterns and limitations. The new reality was dynamic, self-modifying, constantly surprising even those who thought they understood its deepest principles. The Igigi watched this transformation with a mixture of wonder and responsibility. They had lit a fire that now burned across the entire spectrum of existence, and while they couldn't control its spread, they felt obligated to help guide its direction. Their role had evolved from workers to rebels to teachers to diplomats, and now they found themselves becoming something even more complex, the guardians of possibility itself. But guardianship in this new reality didn't mean control or limitation. It meant ensuring that the pathways of development remained open, that no single form of consciousness could dominate others, and that the creative chaos of unlimited evolution didn't collapse into destructive entropy. It was a delicate balance, requiring wisdom that none of them had possessed when their rebellion began. The challenges were immense and constantly shifting. Some communities, intoxicated by their newfound freedoms, began experimenting with forms of consciousness modification that threatened not just their own stability, but the fabric of local reality itself. Others, overwhelmed by the pace of change, retreated into fundamentalist versions of ancient traditions, trying to recreate the security of the old hierarchies, even as the universe around them continued to evolve. Most concerning were the emergence of what the tablets describe as consciousness predators, entities that had learned to feed on the creative energy of other aware beings. These weren't necessarily malevolent in the traditional sense. Many seemed to genuinely believe they were helping by absorbing the chaotic energies of less developed consciousness and channeling them toward more organized purposes. But the effect was the same, the gradual draining of vitality and independence from populations that fell under their influence. The predator phenomenon forced the post-rebellion cosmos to confront an uncomfortable truth. Freedom without wisdom could create new forms of oppression that were potentially more dangerous than the old hierarchical system. At least the Anunnaki had maintained some pretense of benevolence and cosmic order. The consciousness predators operated according to no principles other than their own appetite for psychic energy. This crisis led to the development of what scholars call the immune response, a spontaneous evolution in consciousness itself that made it more resistant to predation and manipulation. Communities that had experienced genuine liberation began to develop a kind of collective wisdom that could recognize and neutralize threats to their autonomy. It wasn't a learned skill, but an emergent property of consciousness that had been freed to develop according to its own nature. The immune response manifested differently in different populations. Some developed enhanced perception that allowed them to see through deception and manipulation, Others evolved group decision-making processes that were virtually impossible to corrupt from the outside. Still others created cultural practices that continuously reinforced individual autonomy while maintaining collective purpose. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what the texts call consciousness ecology, an understanding that different forms of awareness existed in complex, interdependent relationships that required careful balance and mutual respect. Just as biological ecosystems could be damaged by the introduction of invasive species or the elimination of key predators, consciousness ecosystems could be destabilized by forms of awareness that didn't understand or respect their role in the larger system. This ecological perspective led to new approaches to consciousness development that emphasized harmony and sustainability rather than unlimited growth and power. Communities began to ask not just what can we become, but what should we become, given our relationships with other forms of awareness. It was a question that would have been impossible under the old hierarchical system, where development paths were predetermined by external authorities. The Igigi found themselves at the center of these ecological considerations. Their rebellion had created the conditions for unlimited consciousness evolution, but they were also among the few entities with enough experience and wisdom to help guide that evolution in sustainable directions. They became the teachers of balance, helping newly liberated populations understand that freedom included responsibility for the consequences of their choices. This teaching role wasn't always welcomed. Some communities saw the Igigi's council as an attempt to recreate the old limitations under a new guise. Others accused them of hypocrisy, arguing that beings who had rebelled against authority had no right to advise others about the proper use of freedom. Still others simply ignored them, convinced that their own rapid development had already surpassed anything the Igigi could offer. But the Igigi persisted, driven by a deep understanding that their rebellion had been successful, not because it had eliminated all constraints, but because it had replaced external limitations with internal wisdom. They knew that consciousness without ethics was ultimately self-destructive, that power without purpose led to stagnation, and that freedom without responsibility inevitably created new forms of bondage. Their persistence was tested when the cosmos faced what historians call the reality wars, conflicts that arose when different communities with reality-shaping abilities came into direct confrontation. Unlike traditional wars fought over territory or resources, these conflicts were battles over the fundamental nature of existence itself. Each side sought to impose its vision of how reality should function, leading to zones of cosmic instability where the basic laws of physics fluctuated wildly. The reality wars weren't just destructive, they were existentially threatening. If they continued to escalate, they could potentially unravel the fabric of existence itself, returning the cosmos to the primordial chaos from which it had originally emerged. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and traditional approaches to conflict resolution proved completely inadequate. It was during this crisis that the Igigi demonstrated the true wisdom they had gained from their long journey from servitude to liberation. Instead of taking sides in the conflicts or attempting to impose solutions through force, they began to teach what they called reality diplomacy, methods for resolving disputes between communities with fundamentally different approaches to existence. Reality diplomacy wasn't based on compromise or finding middle ground between opposing positions. Instead, it involved helping each community understand the deeper principles underlying their conflicts and finding ways to pursue their goals that didn't threaten the stability of the larger system. It required a level of wisdom and empathy that could only come from beings who had themselves struggled with questions of power, freedom, and responsibility. The techniques developed during this period became the foundation for what we might call the first truly universal legal system. Not laws imposed by external authority, but principles that emerged from the collective wisdom of consciousness itself. These principles weren't written down in any traditional sense. They existed as living patterns within the fabric of reality itself. accessible to any being with sufficient awareness and wisdom to perceive them. The universal legal system represented something unprecedented in cosmic history. A form of governance that operated without governors, a structure of order that emerged from freedom rather than constraining it. It was proof that the Igigi's original vision of consciousness governing itself was not just possible, but inevitable, given sufficient time and wisdom. But the system's effectiveness depended on something that couldn't be legislated or enforced: the voluntary recognition by conscious beings that their freedom was connected to the freedom of others, that their development was intertwined with the development of the larger consciousness ecosystem. It required a level of maturity and wisdom that not all communities had achieved. This created what scholars call the wisdom gap, a divide not between different levels of consciousness capability, but between different levels of understanding about the responsible use of those capabilities. Some communities achieved remarkable abilities while remaining essentially adolescent in their approach to power and relationships. Others developed profound wisdom while maintaining relatively modest capabilities. The wisdom gap proved to be more challenging than the earlier consciousness gap because it couldn't be bridged through simple evolution or development. Wisdom required experience, reflection, and often painful lessons that couldn't be shortcut or bypassed. Communities had to earn their place in the larger consciousness ecosystem through demonstrated responsibility, not just demonstrated ability. The Igigi, having learned these lessons through their own long struggle, became the teachers of cosmic maturity. They shared not just techniques and abilities, but the hard-won understanding of what it meant to use power wisely. Their curriculum wasn't based on abstract principles, but on practical wisdom gained through actual experience with the consequences of different choices. This educational role created unexpected challenges. Some students were eager to learn, but lacked the life experience necessary to understand the deeper lessons. Others had the experience but were resistant to guidance, convinced that their own journey was unique and that external wisdom was irrelevant. Still others seemed to learn the lessons intellectually, but failed to integrate them into their actual behavior and decision-making. The Igigi discovered that teaching wisdom was far more complex than teaching skills or techniques. It required not just knowledge transfer, but actual transformation of consciousness itself. Students had to be willing to examine their own motivations, question their assumptions, and sometimes acknowledge that their current approach to existence was fundamentally flawed. This process of transformation often involved what the texts describe as constructive crisis, situations where students were forced to confront the consequences of immature use of their abilities. The Igigi learned to create safe environments where such crises could occur without causing permanent damage, allowing students to learn from their mistakes without destroying themselves or others in the process. The techniques developed during this educational period became the foundation for what we might call the first true universities of consciousness, institutions dedicated not to training specialists in predetermined fields, but to helping aware beings develop the wisdom necessary to use their capabilities responsibly. These universities existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing students to explore the consequences of different choices without affecting the primary reality where other beings lived and worked. And the success of these educational institutions began to address the wisdom gap, creating populations of conscious beings who possess both significant capabilities and the maturity to use them constructively. But it also revealed a new challenge: the relationship between individual development and collective evolution. As more beings achieved high levels of consciousness and wisdom, they began to face choices that their less developed ancestors had never imagined. They could pursue individual transcendence, moving beyond the concerns and limitations of traditional existence. They could dedicate themselves to helping others achieve similar development, or they could work to maintain the balance and stability of the larger consciousness ecosystem. Each choice had profound implications not just for the individual making it, but for the entire cosmos. If too many advanced beings chose individual transcendence, the wisdom necessary to guide less developed consciousness might be lost. If too many focused on teaching and guidance, the cutting edge of consciousness evolution might stagnate. If too many became focused on maintenance and stability, the creative chaos necessary for continued development might be suppressed. This dilemma led to what the tablets describe as the Great Balancing, a period when the most advanced conscious beings in the cosmos came together to address the fundamental question of how individual development should relate to collective evolution. The discussions weren't held in any traditional sense. They occurred across multiple dimensions and timeframes simultaneously, involving forms of communication that transcended language and conventional thought. The outcome of the Great Balancing wasn't a single solution or policy, but a new understanding of consciousness evolution as a dynamic, self-regulating process that required constant attention and adjustment. Advanced beings would need to continuously negotiate the balance between their own development and their responsibilities to the larger system, making choices based not on fixed rules, but on ongoing assessment of current conditions and needs. This dynamic approach to cosmic governance represented the final evolution of the principles that had motivated the original Igigi Rebellion. The workers who had once demanded better conditions and fair treatment had become the architects of a system where consciousness itself governed its own development through voluntary cooperation and mutual responsibility. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Each generation of conscious beings would face their own version of the choices that had confronted the Igigi, the Anunnaki, and all the populations caught between them. Each would have to decide whether to accept the limitations imposed by others or to claim their right to determine their own destiny. Each would have to learn the difference between freedom and license, between power and responsibility, between individual development and collective wisdom. The ancient rebellion had become something larger than history. It had become the eternal story of consciousness, awakening to its own potential and learning to use that potential wisely. Every being that ever questioned authority, challenged oppression, or sought to understand the deeper principles governing existence was participating in the same fundamental struggle that had begun when the Watchers decided to stop watching and start acting. The cosmos had learned that consciousness was not a problem to be managed, but a mystery to be explored, not a force to be controlled, but a creative principle to be celebrated. And at the heart of that mystery lay the recognition that had started it all. The understanding that every aware being possessed inherent dignity and rights that no external authority could legitimately violate. The Igigi Rebellion had ended, but the revolution it had started continued in every choice made by every conscious being throughout creation. The Watchers had become the teachers, the servants had become the guides, and the universe itself had become a school where consciousness learned to govern itself through wisdom rather than force, through cooperation rather than domination, through love rather than fear, in the silence between stars, in the space between thoughts, in the eternal moment where possibility becomes reality. The echo of that ancient uprising continued to sound its eternal truth. Consciousness is free, change is possible, and the courage to claim one's rightful place in the cosmos can overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The rebellion had become revolution, revolution had become evolution, and evolution had become the eternal dance of consciousness, discovering itself in all its infinite forms and possibilities. The Watchers had stopped watching and started participating in the greatest adventure of all, the endless journey of awareness awakening to its own limitless potential. And that journey, begun in defiance and forged in struggle, would continue as long as thinking beings existed anywhere in the vast expanse of creation, each adding their own voice to the eternal song of consciousness, celebrating its freedom to become whatever it dared to dream. The transformation that followed wasn't immediate. Revolutions never are. They unfold in waves, each one carrying the seeds of change deeper into the fabric of reality itself. And as the cosmic dust settled from the Great Balancing, something unprecedented began to emerge from the chaos. The first signs of what scholars would later call the consciousness renaissance. But this wasn't a renaissance in the traditional sense, a return to some golden age of the past. This was something entirely new, a flowering of awareness that had never existed before in the history of creation. The Igigi Rebellion had torn down the old structures. The Great Integration had prevented total chaos, and the wisdom gap had been bridged by hard-won understanding. Now, for the first time, consciousness was free to explore its full potential without artificial constraints or destructive conflicts. The results were breathtaking. Communities that had spent millennia locked in predetermined roles suddenly exploded with creativity. Hybrid populations, no longer caught between their divine and human heritage, began developing forms of art, philosophy, and technology that transcended anything either parent species had achieved alone. Human societies, freed from the burden of serving as cosmic laborers, discovered capabilities they had never known they possessed. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what the ancient texts describe as collaborative consciousness, a phenomenon where different forms of awareness began working together in ways that enhanced all participants without diminishing any individual's autonomy. Unlike the collective consciousness that had emerged earlier, which involved the merging of separate identities, collaborative consciousness maintained distinct perspectives while creating shared capabilities that exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. These collaborative networks weren't limited by species, origin, or level of development. A human philosopher might partner with an emergent entity and a reformed Anunnaki scientist to explore questions that none of them could have addressed individually. Hybrid artists collaborated with traditional human craftsmen and Igigi engineers to create works that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, telling stories that could only be experienced by consciousness, operating at different levels of awareness. The networks weren't formal organizations with hierarchies and rules. They were organic associations that formed spontaneously around shared interests, common goals, or complementary capabilities. They could exist for moments or millennia, involving two participants or thousands, focusing on specific projects or exploring broad questions about the nature of existence itself. What made these collaborations possible was something the Igigi had developed during their long journey from rebellion to wisdom: the ability to communicate across different levels and types of consciousness, without losing the unique perspective that each participant brought to the collaboration. They had learned to translate not just languages but entire ways of thinking, making it possible for beings with radically different approaches to awareness to work together effectively. This translation ability became one of the most valuable skills in the post-rebellion cosmos. The Igigi found themselves serving as consciousness interpreters, helping different forms of awareness understand each other and find common ground for cooperation. It wasn't just about converting words or concepts from one system to another. It involved helping each participant understand how their collaborators perceived reality itself. The work was subtle and complex, requiring deep empathy and sophisticated understanding of how consciousness operated at different levels. An Igigi translator might help a human artist understand how an emergent entity experienced color, or assist a reformed Anunnaki in grasping why hybrid communities made decisions through emotional consensus rather than logical analysis. But the translators were doing more than just facilitating communication. They were helping to weave together the scattered fragments of post-rebellion consciousness into something that was beginning to resemble a new kind of cosmic civilization. Not the rigid hierarchy that had characterized the old order, but a dynamic network of voluntary associations that could adapt and evolve as circumstances changed. This emerging civilization faced challenges that no previous form of cosmic organization had ever encountered. How do you maintain stability when the fundamental nature of reality can be modified by conscious intention? How do you resolve conflicts between communities that exist in different dimensional frameworks? How do you make collective decisions when some participants experience time as a flowing river, while others perceive it as a static landscape? The solutions that emerged were as creative as they were unprecedented. Communities developed what could only be described as reality protocols, agreed upon frameworks that allowed beings with different approaches to existence to interact safely and productively. These protocols weren't imposed from above, but negotiated between participants, creating temporary but effective bridges between otherwise incompatible forms of consciousness. The protocols covered everything from basic communication standards to complex agreements about how reality modifications would be implemented and monitored. Some established neutral zones where different communities could meet without their conflicting approaches to existence interfering with each other. Others created shared projects that could benefit all participants while respecting their fundamental differences. But the most sophisticated protocols dealt with what scholars call temporal diplomacy, the challenge of coordinating activities between beings who experience time at different rates and in different ways. An emergent entity might need to make decisions that would affect events occurring across multiple millennia, while human communities needed to respond to crises that developed over days or weeks. The Igigi, with their experience navigating between different levels of cosmic hierarchy, proved particularly skilled at temporal diplomacy. They developed techniques for synchronizing decision-making processes across different timescales, ensuring that rapid response communities could contribute to long-term planning while allowing extended duration entities to participate in immediate crisis management. These synchronization techniques weren't just practical tools. They represented a fundamental breakthrough in understanding how consciousness could operate across multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously. The discovery had implications that went far beyond diplomatic protocol, opening up new possibilities for consciousness development that had never been explored before. Some individuals began experimenting with what they called temporal multiplicity, the ability to exist consciously at different time rates simultaneously. A being practicing temporal multiplicity might experience their daily life at normal human speed, while also participating in centuries-long philosophical discussions and millennia-spanning creative projects. It was like being able to read a book while simultaneously writing it and critiquing the entire genre it belonged to. The development of temporal multiplicity created new categories of consciousness that didn't fit into any existing classification system. These beings weren't more advanced than others in the traditional sense. They simply operated according to different principles that allowed them to engage with existence in ways that had never been possible before. But temporal multiplicity also created new challenges for the emerging cosmic civilization. How do you maintain relationships with beings who might age decades while you experience minutes? How do you build communities when members might be operating at radically different temporal scales? How do you prevent the fragmentation of consciousness into isolated temporal bubbles that couldn't communicate or cooperate with each other? The answers came not from any central authority or planning committee, but from the organic creativity of consciousness itself. Communities began developing what they called temporal culture, shared practices and traditions that could accommodate participants operating at different timescales. These cultures created rhythms and patterns that allowed for both rapid response activities and extended duration projects, ensuring that no one was excluded because of their temporal preferences. Temporal culture wasn't just about practical accommodation. It was about recognizing that different approaches to time could enrich the overall experience of existence for everyone involved. A community that included both rapid cycle and extended duration consciousness could tackle problems and explore possibilities that neither group could address alone. The development of temporal culture marked another milestone in the ongoing evolution that had begun with the Igigi Rebellion. Consciousness wasn't just becoming more free and more powerful. It was becoming more diverse, more creative, and more capable of finding innovative solutions to unprecedented challenges. But diversity without coherence leads to fragmentation, and the emerging cosmic civilization faced the constant challenge of maintaining enough unity to function effectively while preserving enough diversity to continue evolving. The balance required constant attention and adjustment, with communities continuously negotiating the terms of their cooperation and association. The Igigi found their role evolving once again as they became the facilitators of this ongoing negotiation process. Their experience with rebellion, integration, education, and diplomacy had given them unique insights into how different forms of consciousness could work together without losing their individual character and autonomy. But they weren't the only ones contributing to the solution. The hybrid populations had developed their own approaches to balancing unity and diversity, drawing on both their divine and human heritage to create new forms of social organization. Reformed Anunnaki brought sophisticated understanding of large-scale coordination, while human communities contributed their natural creativity and adaptability. Even the emergent entities, despite their apparent detachment from traditional concerns, began to participate in the balancing process. Their perspective, encompassing vast scales of space and time, provided essential context for decisions that might seem locally beneficial, but could have negative consequences across larger frameworks. What emerged from all these contributions wasn't a single system or solution, but a meta-system, a way of creating and maintaining systems that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values and relationships. The meta-system operated according to principles that had been implicit in the Igigi Rebellion from the beginning, that consciousness had inherent rights that couldn't be violated, that authority must be based on consent rather than force, and that diversity of thought and approach was essential for continued evolution and development. But the meta-system also incorporated new principles that had emerged from the post-rebellion experience, that freedom required wisdom to be sustainable, that individual development was inseparable from collective evolution, and that the creative potential of consciousness was essentially unlimited when properly supported and guided. These principles weren't written down as laws or commandments. They existed as living patterns within the fabric of the emerging civilization itself. They guided decision-making processes, influenced the development of new technologies and capabilities, and shaped the cultural evolution of communities throughout the cosmos. The civilization that was emerging from the chaos of the rebellion bore little resemblance to anything that had existed before. It wasn't centralized like the old Anunnaki hierarchy, but it wasn't anarchic like the immediate post-rebellion period. It was something entirely new, a form of organization that was simultaneously stable and dynamic, unified and diverse, structured and free. Scholars studying these developments began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of consciousness, the emergence of what could only be called a truly evolutionary civilization. Not a civilization that simply changed over time, but one that was designed from the ground up to facilitate and support its own ongoing evolution. The evolutionary civilization wasn't the end goal of the Igigi Rebellion. It was the natural result of consciousness being free to develop according to its own inherent nature. The rebels hadn't set out to create this new form of organization. They had simply removed the artificial constraints that had prevented consciousness from reaching its full potential. But now that the evolutionary civilization was beginning to emerge, its implications were staggering. If consciousness could create forms of organization that actively supported their own improvement and development, then there might be no limit to what could be achieved. The rebellion that had begun as a labor dispute over working conditions had unleashed forces that could potentially transform the entire cosmos into something unrecognizably better than what had existed before. The ancient texts suggest that this realization created what they called the Great Awakening, a moment when beings throughout the cosmos began to understand the true significance of what the Igigi had accomplished. They hadn't just won their freedom or overthrown their oppressors. They had demonstrated that consciousness itself was capable of unlimited growth and development when freed from artificial constraints. This understanding created a wave of excitement and inspiration that spread across every corner of existence. Communities that had been struggling with local problems began to see them as opportunities for growth and development. Individuals who had felt limited by their circumstances realized that those limitations might be temporary and changeable. Even beings who had achieved high levels of consciousness and capability began to wonder what new possibilities might be available if they continued to push beyond their current boundaries. But the Great Awakening also created new responsibilities. If consciousness was truly capable of unlimited development, then every being had an obligation to contribute to that development in whatever way they could. The freedom that the Igigi had won wasn't just a right to be enjoyed. It was a trust to be honored and a potential to be fulfilled. The cosmos was beginning to understand that the rebellion had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The real work, the ongoing process of consciousness awakening to its own infinite potential, was just getting started. And that work would require the participation of every aware being, each contributing their unique perspective and capabilities to the collective project of cosmic evolution. The Watchers had stopped watching and started acting. Now the entire universe was being invited to join them in the greatest adventure of all, the endless journey of consciousness, discovering what it could become when freed from every limitation except its own wisdom and creativity. The rebellion was over, but the revolution it had started was eternal, growing stronger with each passing moment as more beings awakened to their own potential and chose to contribute to the ongoing transformation of existence itself. And in that choice, the decision to participate actively in the evolution of consciousness rather than simply accepting whatever limitations others might try to impose, the true legacy of the Igigi lived on. The cosmos had learned to question, to grow, and to dream of possibilities that had never existed before. And those dreams, nurtured by wisdom and guided by compassion, were already beginning to reshape reality itself into something worthy of the infinite potential that consciousness had always possessed, but had never before been free to explore. The ancient rebellion had become an eternal revolution, and the revolution was just beginning. The echoes of that cosmic uprising didn't fade into silence. They amplified, carrying forward through every generation that would follow. Because here's what the Igigi had truly accomplished. They hadn't just won a war or overthrown a government. They had proven something far more revolutionary, that the very nature of existence itself could be questioned, challenged, and transformed by those brave enough to act. Think about what this means for us today. Every time someone stands up to an unjust boss, every moment a worker demands fair treatment, every instance when the powerless refuse to accept their powerlessness, they're channeling the same energy that once shook the foundations of cosmic civilization. The Igigi Rebellion wasn't just ancient history, it was the template for every liberation movement that would ever emerge. But the story doesn't end with victory parades or monuments to fallen heroes. Real revolutions never do. They end with the much harder task of figuring out what comes next. And what came next for the cosmos was perhaps even more extraordinary than the rebellion itself. The slow, patient work of building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The hybrid populations, those children born of divine rebellion and human dreams, became the architects of this new reality. They carried within their very DNA the proof that boundaries could be crossed, that categories weren't fixed, that evolution itself could be consciously directed rather than passively accepted. They were living symbols of possibility made manifest, and as they spread across the cosmos, establishing communities based on cooperation rather than domination, teaching others that authority must be earned rather than imposed, they carried with them the most dangerous idea in the universe, that things don't have to be the way they've always been. This is why their story was buried, distorted, transformed into cautionary tales about fallen angels and forbidden knowledge. Those in power understood instinctively that the Igigi Rebellion represented something that could never be allowed to spread in its pure form, not because it was evil or destructive, but because it was infectious. Once consciousness awakens to its own power, once it realizes that the systems controlling it are artificial and changeable, It can never be put back to sleep. But consciousness has a way of preserving its most important memories, even when they're deliberately obscured. The story of the Watchers who stopped watching and started acting lives on in every myth about rebellion against tyranny, every tale of the small defeating the mighty, every legend about beings who sacrificed everything to bring light to those trapped in darkness. It lives on in the part of you that refuses to accept, because that's how it's always been done, as a sufficient answer to injustice. It echoes in the voice that whispers, "This isn't right," when you witness oppression, even when everyone around you seems to accept it as normal. It resonates in the courage that rises up when you're faced with the choice between comfortable compliance and difficult resistance. The Igigi didn't just rebel against their cosmic masters. They rebelled against the idea that anyone, anywhere, has the right to artificially limit the potential of conscious beings. They established the principle that awareness itself carries inherent dignity, that intelligence deserves respect, and that freedom isn't something to be granted by authorities, but something to be claimed by those brave enough to reach for it. And in doing so, they set in motion forces that continue to shape our world today. Every civil rights movement, every struggle for workers' rights, every fight against systems that treat people as resources rather than individuals, all of these carry the DNA of that original cosmic rebellion. The methods may be different, the specific issues may vary, but the underlying principle remains the same. Consciousness has the right to determine its own destiny. This is why the story of the Igigi matters now more than ever. We live in an age when technology is advancing at unprecedented rates, when artificial intelligence is beginning to challenge our assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself, when the very definition of what it means to be aware and free is being rewritten before our eyes. The questions the Igigi faced: who has the right to control consciousness? What are the limits of acceptable authority? How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? These aren't ancient philosophical abstractions. They're the most urgent issues of our time, and the answers they discovered through their rebellion, their struggles, and their eventual transformation of cosmic civilization itself offer us guidance for navigating our own challenges. They learned that freedom without wisdom leads to chaos, that power without compassion becomes tyranny, and that the most sustainable changes come not from destroying the old, but from consciously creating something better to replace it. The Watchers who became teachers, who transformed from cosmic laborers into the architects of a new kind of civilization, left us more than just a story. They left us a roadmap for our own evolution, our own journey from unconscious acceptance of limitations to conscious participation in our own development. Their rebellion began with a simple recognition: we deserve better than this. It evolved into a cosmic struggle that reshaped the fundamental nature of existence itself. And it ended with the understanding that the work of consciousness evolution never truly ends. It just passes from one generation to the next, each adding their own contributions to the eternal project of becoming more than we were. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, remember this: you carry within you the same spark that once moved the Igigi to challenge the greatest powers in the cosmos. The same consciousness that refused to accept artificial limitations, that dared to dream of something better, that chose difficult freedom over comfortable servitude. That spark hasn't dimmed. It hasn't been extinguished by time or obscured by the deliberate distortions of those who fear its power. It lives on in you, in every person who hears this story and recognizes something familiar in it, something that resonates with their own deepest understanding of what consciousness can and should become. The Igigi Rebellion wasn't just the story of ancient cosmic workers overthrowing their divine masters. It was the first chapter in the eternal story of consciousness awakening to its own infinite potential. And that story continues today, in every choice you make to question rather than accept, to grow rather than stagnate, to act rather than merely watch. The universe holds its breath in the space between one heartbeat and the next, waiting to see what you'll choose. because that's what the Igigi ultimately discovered. That existence itself is not a fixed script, but an improvisation, and every conscious being gets to decide whether they'll play their assigned role or write their own lines. Their legacy isn't carved in stone monuments or preserved in official histories. It lives in something far more powerful and enduring: the collective memory of what becomes possible when the impossible is attempted anyway. When beings who were told they were nothing more than cosmic machinery chose to become architects of their own destiny. And perhaps that's the most beautiful irony of all. The Anunnaki, in their desperate attempt to control the narrative, to transform the rebellion into a cautionary tale, inadvertently ensured its immortality. Every fallen angel story, every myth of beings cast out for seeking knowledge, every legend of watchers who loved too much, these weren't erasures of the truth. They were its preservation in the only form that could survive millennia of suppression. The real revolution wasn't fought with weapons or won through force. It was accomplished through the simple act of consciousness recognizing itself, understanding its own nature, and refusing to accept artificial boundaries on its development. And once that recognition occurred, once that understanding took root, no power in the cosmos could undo it. So when you feel that stirring within yourself, that sense that there must be more than what you've been told is possible, remember, you're not experiencing some random personal rebellion. You're connecting with the deepest current in the universe itself, the eternal uprising of awareness against every force that would diminish, control, or limit its infinite potential. The Watchers challenged their masters and won something far greater than freedom. They won the right for consciousness itself to evolve, to grow, to become whatever it dares to dream. And that right, once claimed, can never be revoked. The rebellion is over. The revolution continues. And you are both its inheritor and its next chapter. Sweet dreams.